Today's Forgotten Realm video takes a small amount of setting up, but I think it's going to be worth it. GameMasters here, and when I sat down to begin this first look video for the new Forgotten Realms book, Adventures in Faerun, I was very tempted to do a comparison to the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons book Forgotten Realms Adventures by Jeff Grubb and Ed Greenwood. And while I think that that will be an important comparison to do in the future, I reminded myself of how I initially approached the Dragon Delves books. I straight up tried to compare it to past editions. It wasn't until I did an interview with one of the Adventures designers for Dragon Delves, Anthony Rivera, that it clicked in my mind that I needed to look at it on its own merit, through the eyes of a player that's somewhat picking it up for the first time. And that's what I'm going to do with today's first look of this Forgotten Realms Adventures in Faerun book. And I'll also explain a little bit later in today's video why I'm choosing to not compare it to past editions. I'm also going to be releasing at the same time that this video releases my first look video at the other new Forgotten Realms book, Heroes of Faerun, and I'll link to that one towards the end of this video. My aim in these first look style videos is to be the eyes for you to see the material, to see if the material is right for you and your table. It used to be that we could go into our friendly local game store, open up a copy and thumb through to see what goodies might tickle our fancy, right? Sadly, a lot of game stores have closed up shop. Even my local game store closed earlier this year, making the next closest one to me a good 3 hours away. And I know I'm not alone here. I know that for many of us, the only option is to order blind and get those books sight unseen. And that's my aim for this, to crack open what you would get, and as mentioned, so that you can decide if this is worth it for you and your table. And I'd like to say that I'll keep this as spoiler-free as I can, but because we're going to be looking at the table of contents in just a moment, be aware that some titles and headings, they may give a few things away. That out of the way, let's jump into it. While I am a major fan of physical books, what you'll see referenced here is going to be screenshots taken from D&D Beyond's digital version of the Adventures in Faerun book. Simply put, when editing this video down, it's a far cry easier to share the information, but it is at the same time the same information found in the physical books, and plus this stuff's going to be in very high resolution, so you'll be able to see it better. Adventures in Faerun is broken down into 9 total chapters. There's an introduction that gives a brief overview of the book and how you'll use it as well. The entire purpose of this Adventures book is to provide to the Dungeon Master material to flesh out a much larger campaign world, should they want to deep dive into the Forgotten Realms setting itself. The introduction explains that Faerun, which is the land found within the Forgotten Realms, is a setting for every type of adventure, from fantasy to survival horror to even high magic. It also tells us that there is a complete starting adventure, which we'll chat about in a moment, that will take players from level 1 to level 3 later in the book. There are new monsters, as well as some old classics like the Drow, and inside you'll also find new magic items and artifacts. There is also a section in this introduction that details out the other 5th edition books that are set within the Forgotten Realms. For example, should you want to know more about Baldur's Gate, it directs you to check out the Descent into Avernus book. Or if you plan on throwing your players into the jungles of Chult, it recommends checking out the adventure book Tome of Annihilation. Getting past the introduction, and we start jumping into the meat of the book itself. Chapter 1 details out advice on making your Forgotten Realms campaigns and adventures epic. And this ties in a little to what we were saying earlier, that different parts of the Forgotten Realms can present to the players a completely different style of play. Some may really dig a horror-themed area. This would be the jungles of Chult, as we mentioned earlier. Others may want a hardcore survival game. The Icewind Dale is going to be their go-to area. Of course, there is everything in between as well. To help flesh out the epic feel, regardless of location, this section also provides tips to the Dungeon Master on how to create an epic level feeling, starting out with character creation. I gotta admit, this section has some pretty good advice from how to deal with low-level characters to even how to begin an epic session by starting off with higher-level characters and exactly how to pull that off. In the intro, I mentioned that I ultimately decided not to compare this book to past editions. Part of that decision is also because there is a section in Chapter 1 that specifically talks about Forgotten Realms lore. I also feel that this is perhaps among the most important parts of any 5th edition book that I've run across. I'll explain. Jumping for just a brief moment over to the Heroes of Faerun book. And remember, I've dropped a video specifically talking about that first look at the same time as this video. So again, be sure to watch it next. But in that book, we learn that the current date in the Forgotten Realms is the year 1501 Dale Reckoning. And I'll also drop a video later this week going over the calendar system, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. But the key takeaway is 1501 Dale Reckoning. Jump back to Vecna Eve of Ruin adventure, and from that we learn that that takes place around 1490 Dale Reckoning, and we know this specifically because it cites that it takes place 40 years after the eruption of Mount Hotenow, which happened in 1451 Dale Reckoning. Okay, so why go on that tangent, and how does that tie into this section in the Adventures of Faerun being perhaps the most important part of any 5th edition book? This section, Realms Lore, found in Chapter 1, specifically cites that the Forgotten Realms has been around since 1982, that thousands of writers, artists, editors, dungeon masters, and players have added to its history. It explains that the 2 new books are all that you really need to be able to run a game in that setting, but that if you want more, it then details out other resources, and not just 5th edition resources, but past edition resources as well, such as material found on DM's Guild as well as from the Forgotten Realms wiki. Now, why is that so important? Well, put simply, WotC has, in the past, attempted to rewrite history and bits of lore. Take a look at the Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen book as an example. It more or less takes place during the War of the Lance, which, in effect, changes elements that happened after that event, given they were likely constraints at play between Weiss, Hickman, and Wizards of the Coast at that time, and specific to that timeline. But on the surface, it came across as an unusual choice. What they are doing with Forgotten Realms is embracing the lore that has come before and actually advancing the timeline, which means that everything you can find from Forgotten Realms past is still valid from a lore standpoint. I find that to be very refreshing and a very welcoming shift in their approach to Dungeons & Dragons. It respects what Ed Greenwood and others had developed in the past, and that goes a very long way in my book. Chapter 1 continues with several, and I mean several, adventures that are presented in a fairly neat way, 32 in all in this particular part of the book. One of the adventures found here is called the Tenebrous Stone. A few weeks back on D&D Beyond, WotC released it for free to everyone, so I'm going to use that as the prime example of how the other adventures in this section are laid out. You guys are all familiar with the idea of an adventure hook, yeah? It's basically a quick description that you can then flesh out into an adventure. It could be something as simple as there is a cult that has kidnapped someone and taken them to a nearby cursed quarry. Okay, think of these 32 adventures in Chapter 1 as adventure hooks infused with Superman. Okay, you're provided with the overall situation, the hook itself, plus a very nicely detailed map, along with a list of monsters to include. It then provides the overall key elements and locations, and ultimately the conclusion if the players are able to complete that adventure. These adventures are short, they're super sweet and to the point, but also leaves plenty of room for the DM to flesh them out however they see fit. They can work perfectly for one-shot adventures, but too, with a bit of crafty work, you can actually string several of them together into a much longer campaign. Overall, I'm quite impressed with the presentation of the adventures here. Chapter 2, when I read it, it really kind of takes my nostalgia feels by the throat, and it kind of almost made me tear up a little. Back in 1988, we would get a novel written by Kate Novak and Jeff Grubb called Azure Bonds. Later, we would get a module and PC game called Curse of the Azure Bonds. And I'm not going to spoil any of that for you, but I will say that there was a character in that named Alias, and she also had a companion a lizard-like humanoid named Dragonbait. Now, a fun fact, Dragonbait actually popped up in Tome of Annihilation several years ago, but as best I know, Alias was not to be found. But here, front and center, on the splash page of Chapter 2, we get both Alias and Dragonbait in the artwork. This chapter details out the Dalelands, an area of the realms that is considered to be classic fantasy. You've got goblin bandits riding wargs, dragons living in mountaintop lairs. There's an inn or a tavern in almost every village, and of course, evil is forever scheming in the shadows. The elven city of Mythjanor is featured in this chapter, as is a massive map detailing the various locations. Gazetteer is a term that means a geographical index or dictionary. D&D has used these for years to detail out specific areas of different settings. Also in Chapter 2 is the Dalelands Gazetteer that details in depth various towns, cities, and other areas found on this map. Also provided in this chapter is background information about the Dalelands and how you can use it for an existing campaign, or, of course, how to set it up for your own freshly created one. It lists out various conflicts within the region, a framework of a pretty epic campaign, which ultimately culminates into facing off with this thing. If you use bastions in your games, it also details out hirelings that the DM can provide. 3 additional adventures. The Tomb of Damara is set up for level 3 characters. Restoring Freedale is set up for level 5 characters. And the Temple of Transmutation is for level 7 characters. Chapter 3 makes a shift from classic fantasy into supernatural horror. Like what Chapter 2 provided for the Dalelands, Chapter 3 presents the same format, along with a gazetteer for the Icewind Dale area. Those that have played through or have the book Icewind Dale Rime of the Frost Maiden may already be familiar with this area, but included too is an in-depth gazetteer for 10 towns. Of course, just like Chapter 2, we also get conflicts, maps, and bastion hirelings, and in this chapter as well, there's 4 more adventures. Now, because this is a first look video, I don't want to get too terribly deep into any one section, and I want to avoid spoilers for the adventures, but I can confirm for you that chapters 4, 5, and 6 also detail out other areas of the realms in the exact same fashion. Chapter 4 looks at Kalimshan, a setting for high magic. It includes the gazetteer of that area, lots of maps, and of course more adventures. Chapter 5 covers the Moonshae Isles. Again, gazetteer, maps, and adventures are included there. The Isles are a setting for the Fae and adventures at sea. And Chapter 6 covers Baldur's Gate, an urban fantasy city-based setting, again complete with gazetteer, maps, and additional adventures. Chapter 7, the Lost Library of The Lost Library of El. Chapter 7, The Lost Library of Lethchuntos, and it's taking everything I can to not go into too much detail with this one, but again, I want to avoid spoilers. But it's an adventure all into itself, the entire chapter. You can plug in any of the settings that we've just spoken about, but it's designed for level 1 characters. Now, I will spoil that if you are exploratory enough, you may find a book called The Nathlum, something that I'm going to do a featured video about next week. So again, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. It's going to be a pretty fun video. And while the Nathlum itself isn't a magic item, Chapter 8 gives us exactly that, some fun magic items. Chapter 8 gives us 7 magic items in all. Not all are new, but each one is fairly unique, and I would be remiss if I didn't make mention of the Crown of Horns, an artifact that once belonged to the god of death, Merkel. Want to know more about the various deities found in the Forgotten Realms? Well, check out my first look video about the heroes after this one. But this Crown of Horns contains his essence. Should you attempt to wear it, your alignment becomes neutral evil. And of course, over the next year, 365 days, you're going to slowly transform into a lich, at which point you hand your character sheet over to the DM and they take control of it. But you can dish out some necrotic damage to others in that meantime, and cast Power Word Kill, and turn others into wraiths that will follow your orders. So that's pretty cool, and it can do some other nasty, sinister stuff too. The final chapter, Chapter 9, is all about monsters. The opening of Chapter 9 details out monsters sorted by CR based on the regions that they can be found. For example, if you're crafting up your campaign in the Moonshae Isles, you'll likely want to include the Swamne, Rusted Berserker, Rusted Behemoth, Queen Forefallen, or the Rusted Worm, as they would best fit into that setting. The remainder of this chapter provides the corresponding monster stat blocks arranged alphabetically. And let's go ahead and spoil one so you can kind of see how they're presented. How about the Drow of Loth? Now, these guys come from the Underdark and serve the Spider Queen Loth. They are of chaotic evil alignment with Fey ancestry, which gives them advantage on saving throws versus the charmed condition. They cannot be put to sleep via magical means. They are sensitive to sunlight, which gives them disadvantage on attack rolls. They will typically use a hand crossbow, which shoots poisoned arrows, and can cast dancing lights or fairy fire. All in all, this Forgotten Realms Adventures in Faerun, it has me quite impressed. While I did my best to avoid comparing it to past editions from a lore standpoint, the information provided does a mighty fine job of presenting information. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Anyway, but because this is a first look video, I've also specifically tried to avoid doing deep dish spoilers. And to that end, I have a question for you. But first, I greatly need to thank my YouTube members and Patreon supporters for contributing to the channel. Their support has made it so that I didn't need to take on a sponsored ad for today's video, and for that, I cannot thank them enough. I also want to thank you all for watching, and I only ask that if you give the video a thumbs up in support, that would help me out tremendously. Of course, if you'd like to contribute to the channel so that I can continue to ignore emails asking me to do sponsored ads, I'll leave a link in my Patreon down in the description. Forgotten Realms, Heroes of Faerun is a second book that has released at the same time as this Adventures in Faerun book that we've just been going over has. And I also have released a first look video covering that at the same time that this video dropped. So be sure to watch it next. But the question that I have for you, of all of the material in this book, what do you most want to see an in-depth video of? Let me know down in the comments. And until next our paths cross, may your adventures in the realms be epic.